All right, here we are. It's the Friday FARcast. We are back again, and this is where I get to speak with other people versus just speaking myself, which I really like to do. Not speak with myself, but speak with other people, because I always find people really fascinating and interesting. And today's guest promises to be both of those things in spades. And I'm talking about Gary Robson, also known as Gazza Rob, over on Twitter, which is where we met. Hold on, let me get rid of that. Where we met, sort of over the last 4 years since COVID started, and have exchanged a few things, going back and forth through Twitter and DMs, and then I did a show last week on the Brexit chart, and Gary reached out to me and said, thank you for doing the show. Brought up a lot of stuff for me, and I said, well, hey man, why don't we see if we can, kickstart this thing again? Because we had talked about doing a show together a while back, and I guess it's all about timing, and the timing is right. So here he is today. And first of all, let me just officially welcome you to the show, Gary.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And what I want to do is I want to read your bio, and then I'm going to give people a sense as to what you've been up to. All right. So this is first person. I'm reading it first person. You wrote this, which is maybe just the fact that I'm from London, 65-year-old father of 3 daughters, spent the first 42 years of my life living in London. Since then in Krakow, my wife is Polish. Left school when I was 16, did mostly unskilled construction jobs, then went to university at 27, and graduated when I was 30, got my PhD at 40-ish. See myself as someone who came into academia from the outside. By the way, I respect you for that. That's not easy.
No.
So I look at the profession and its institutions, especially in UK, US, kind of sideways and very critically. Still feel in some deep sense to be working class person in terms of social consciousness and values. Though objectively, I've risen to a fairly good position in a very bourgeois profession. Paradoxes abound. We're going to get into some of those paradoxes in a different form later on.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier this year, I was baptized in the Orthodox Church in Moldova, which has put me onto a different sort of trajectory than hitherto. So we're going to get into that. And then I'm just going to run through some of your publications. The first one is Class Criminality and Embodied Consciousness, Charlie Richardson and the Southeast London Habitus Center for Urban and Community Research. That's the occasional paper at London Goldsmith College. This is the big one. This is the one that was this for your PhD dissertation?
Yeah. No one likes it. Yeah.
There's the Millwall Football Club, Masculine Belonging, Race and Belonging, and then No One Likes Us, We Don't Care, the myth and reality of Millwall fandom. And that was published on what? Oxford Berg? Is that right?
It was. See, these publishers, the big ones eat the little. The big fish eat the little ones all the time, like in any of these things. So it was a pretty good publisher at the time, based in Oxford. I don't think it exists anymore, but yeah, it was an Oxford thing. New York and London. One of those.
I'm just gonna give people. And it's so funny because when you and I were talking before the show, I'm like, wow, that is a really impressive list of work. Like you've been really prolific. And you were like, well, according to academia, I'm not prolific enough.
No, I'm barely even in the game. You're supposed to be publishing all of the time. You accrue points from publishing all of the time. And this has a payoff for your development of your career. And actually, I'm compared to most people of my kind of age who've been in the game for like 20, 23, 24 years, it wouldn't be a very long list. But that's all I've been able to do,
So let's start with Millwall Football Club, Masculinity, Race and Belonging, and then No One Likes Us, We Don't Care, the myth and reality of Millwall fandom. And let's just jump to the last two, Generation Z, surveillance, capitalism, and the emerging digital technocracy. And then from last year, Virtually Lost, Young Americans in the Digital Technocracy, published on in London on Routledge Press, which is a pretty serious press. So we go from understanding like the social milieu that you grew up in, experienced, and then are looking at, observing, and breaking it down from a different perspective, right? Which is, it seems to be very visceral and very physical. And then here you are now, you've gone from the visceral and the physical to the virtual in your last two works, which is all about the surveillance state. And it feels like it's really kind of an arc of our time.
That could be, but when you put it like that, what comes to my mind is they're actually these two things, which look like they're very different, are actually connected by one very deep thing, which is when I was doing my research for the Millwall book, I've been very interested in the question of the body, embodiment, embodied culture, embodied self-awareness, and all of that. And at the time I was studying for my PhD, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the body kind of emerged as a topic, and so if one thing joins those things, each end of my career, it would be a preoccupation with, for example, if the Millwall thing is all about, it's largely about the body. It's largely about what they used to call kind of a physical capital. It's about how men from working class communities in England back in the 70s and 80s and 90s may have accumulated a lot of kind of physical capital while not accumulating very much financial or cultural kind of capital. So it was about trying to understand what was happening at those football games through the idea that certain sections of the society where it really embodied their culture rather than were in a concrete way, rather than being moved around and motivated by abstractions.
Right.
And in the British case, and in many cases across the world, I think that came in my mind down to a class thing. So since I brought my own issues of being kind of working class into a very middle class environment, I found that I was trying to bridge, and then I gave up trying to bridge, trying to somehow survive in two very different kind of environments with very different varieties of social consciousness, if this makes sense. Yep. So you're in the university, it's cultural capital, it's concepts, it's books, it's the world of ideas. And these are all abstractions. And I go back to I go to a Millwall game. I was a Millwall fan before I did the research, or I go back to see my family, in South London, and none of that is happening. Things are concrete and real. They're not abstract and virtual in another sense,
Right.
And I'm trying to just kind of put all this together and understand it. But the thing that unites that kind of brings together the stuff about the technocracy and the way in which young people are being shaped, I think, subjected to more and more kind of cybernetic control through their phones as a precursor of their involvement in a technocracy that's coming in terms of their programming or conditioning.
Right.
I think that's all being so successfully done precisely because they are not in their bodies, because they've been moved completely to the realm of abstractions, and their bodies have somehow been left behind or atrophied or don't matter anymore. So one thing that's connected all the stuff I've been interested in is this question of the clash, in a way, between embodied culture and mentalistic abstraction, and the way that, for me, in a kind of in a sociological way, that translated itself in England when I was living there into different social groups.
Right.
That was really what was going on there. Because one thing I noticed, because I did a lot of qualitative interviews with these Millwall guys, and I should say before we go any further that the Millwall fans, who come from a small club in southeast London, where I come from, are the most notorious football hooligans in Britain. So they just exist as a sort of a symbol. So when I was trying to write something about them to get certain things off my chest and understand things better, those being my local guys, I found that, for example, if I interviewed them, they didn't have much to say. You could sit down with them, you can do a kind of qualitative interview, and I would ask them questions, and they wouldn't say very much. if I got 4 or 5 of them around a table in a pub and asked them the similar questions, what happened was that they brought something alive amongst themselves. You know, they would finish one another's sentences. And there was obviously a kind of culture there residing inside them that had to be kind of made to emerge. I don't know if this is getting too sociological. Stop me.
No. My audience loves it. So, and I'm following you. Yep.
So this is the big thing. There are 2 kind of worlds that I'm trying to understand how they work. And to begin with, I didn't really understand it was a class thing. On the one hand, there is the world of ideas, abstractions, explicit explanations for everything. When somebody is talking, an educated middle-class person talks, they give you the full idea. They give you rounded sentences. They can make abstract things understandable. They can work with these abstract complexities. The guys I'm talking about, which are also the guys I grew up around, don't do that. What they do is they share a kind of a life world, or they shared a life world, as Husserl put it. And the real tragedy and drama of what's happening in Britain this week, in England this week, is the destruction of those kinds of local life worlds. I think the deliberate destruction of those local life worlds, collectively shared senses of identity, grounded in physical culture. So what I found when I started to try and research those guys was that if you asked them to work in abstractions, you got almost nothing in terms of material you could use to try and figure them out or write about them. If you talked to them in groups and also went on the kind of physical went into the world of the kind of embodied activities they did, going to football games, maybe doing a bit of fighting, certainly doing a lot of physical, forms of expression, I noticed that 2 things. One is that they had a kind of collective life world that was concrete and not abstract. And therefore, this idea you find in anthropology of people in various cultures in the world really embodying their culture in an implicit way rather than explaining it all the time and using words and concepts to say who they are. So what I was trying to do was take what I learned in the anthropological literature about implicit culture, practical culture, as it's called, and apply it to a group of like working class guys in London in the 1990s, really. So that's the thing. But the key point in all of that was I got really into that stuff about the body, and the stuff about the body in a different context is what I'm interested in now, because I think this new trend we have of young people like the Zoomers living in a largely disembodied realm is having real consequences for them. And I think most of these consequences are not really to be welcomed for their own benefit.
Right. I want to go back to your early days in London, growing up there, what it was like, being a fan of Millwall, and then, kind of moving into the Millwall club and kind of on the periphery of that. Right. I want to get there. But you and I, before I hit the start button, we're having a very interesting conversation. And I don't want to let that conversation kind of linger too long, because it seems appropriate to bring it up in light of what you're saying. And I was on Twitter and I was responding to a tweet by a guy whom I really like. He's really smart. He has a really kind of 40,000 foot view of consciousness, right? And he's very into ideas of alchemy, and he's very conversant in that language. And I really respect this guy. So it's not like I don't respect him, and I don't respect what he brings, because I think it's really good. But he put this post up, and it was it was the Aeon in the Tarot, which is the 21st card, which is the I think it's the new time, right? And he starts to talk about like consciousness and Maya and illusion, right? And then, as that we get caught in this trap as a body when we identify with this or we identify with that, and that all is Maya and all is illusion. And I thought to myself, well, I have to respond to this, because I mean, this is just for me. I don't know where you fall on this equation, but I feel like we often get trapped in this binary world of dual and non-dual. right? You're either in the world and you identify with the thing that you're identifying with, or you're not in the world, right? And you're detached and you're kind of this free floating sort of cloud of I don't know,
Pure consciousness.
abstraction, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And I've always like fought against that because I felt like, and I still feel that we're both, right? And
Sure.
that's the hardest thing for a lot of people to wrap their heads around is that, yeah, we are the body, but we're not the body. We're not the body, but we are the body.
See, I think I agree. This is very interesting. For me, we have to try and negotiate both. And this has become even more of an issue for me since I kind of became orthodox and went much deeper into my spiritual side than before. But I don't think it has to. Does it have to be either or? To me, we make connections with people. We make deep connections with people. We love people. The love is real. The love is part of the bigger love. And I can't. I don't see how you can just you form these attachments, which of course are the bad thing in the veil of Maya. You don't want to be making attachments, but you do make attachments, and these attachments we make to others are amongst the most meaningful and significant things we ever do, aren't they?
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, I would some days on a bad day, I feel like I would love to kind of spiritually kind of ascend to some kind of state where none of that stuff matters anymore. But then I feel like I'd be less than human. I'll be losing some of my humanity in that. Is the way I see it.
Yeah.
And I think that attachment to people and it brings out the best in us. At the worldly level, in the kind of materium, is amongst the most significant stuff we do. And so I've never been able to just kind of keep that at a far distance, nor really wanted to.
Right.
Because I think maybe you negotiate the unknowable mysteries of existence while doing very meaningful and attachments based on love and loyalty and really serious and deep things in this life, in this world, while you're moving through. So I've always tried to just, which is very, very difficult.
It is
difficult. Yeah, it's really difficult if you take the more spiritual, abstracted part seriously.
Right.
And I'm a Taurus. I'm quite an earthbound kind of guy. I must say, I'm not a big guy for. This is full disclosure. I'm not a big guy for astrology. The only person I've ever listened to speak about astrology is you. Because then because I find it very stimulating and informative and interesting, and you get insights from it. But I just was never prepared. Although the older I get, the more I yearn for some more deeply spiritual kind of answers or dimension to existence. I still think it's the connections and attachments you make to people which shouldn't just be made little of. I think they should be made much of. And in that kind of regard, what I've been feeling as events have unfolded this week in England, even though I haven't lived there for 22 years, I'm feeling the pull of the attachment to a specific group of people.
Interesting.
With whom I shared at least one point a life world.
Yep.
And an understandable and knowable kind of reality based on affection, loyalty, and commitment to being a particular group of people in a particular place and time, and all of that. And my take on what's happening in England now is we're seeing finally, after decades, a kind of unbridled cry of pain at those life worlds and that kind of level of meaningfulness and attachment to a culture being destroyed.
Yep.
So that's how I kind of would put those things together.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I talked about in that thread and then I shared with you was like, I could completely understand, wrap my head around that I am just passing through, right? Like, this is who I am in this lifetime. I happen to look like this, I'm basically a white guy in a meat suit in this lifetime, right? But it would be disingenuous of me to not accept that and not like say, okay, well, this is who I am, right? And if that's true, which it is, I have a son who looks like me and is kind of the version of me, right? And in our current culture, he's at the bottom of the DEI pyramid, And it would be, again, disingenuous for me to not notice that, right? It would be disembodied on my part, right? And then the other thing that I brought up, and then we got into we were starting to go somewhere, and I said, okay, we got to revisit this when we start the show. And that goes to the fact that my grandmother was born in Liverpool. And even though her mother's originally from Ireland, but she was born in Liverpool, her father is a Liverpudlian, right? So that means that my blood goes to that place, right? Through her and through that city and through that country and the people that are associated with that. And again, in this lifetime, it would be disingenuous for me to not recognize that this is like a blood tie that I have to these people, right? And then what we do with that and all the inherent conflict and contrast and paradox is, it's part of the journey, right? And so I brought this up, then you just kind of ran with it and said, well, this is kind of the basis of my work in relating to the local culture and where we come from.
This is a very important point, because the whole reason I got into I went to university was because I left school when I was 16. I didn't really have qualifications. In those days, this would be in like 75. From my community, you just left school as soon as you could when you were 16, as soon as you were allowed, and you started working. So that was the thing. So I had no conception. There was nothing on my radar about higher education, going further in education. I couldn't wait to escape from school. For me, it was like a prison. I absolutely couldn't wait to get out of there. I was really pissed off because 2 years before, you were allowed to leave school in England when you were 15, and I felt I'd missed the boat, and I was trapped for another year. So I had no conception of. I wasn't reading books. I was living very much a local life, and as I started to read from the age of about 18, independently. After the punk thing, which is maybe something we should talk about, because that set me on. I went from Millwall to punk to.
Well, we got to talk about punk.
To books and ideas.
Yeah.
And after 10 years of that, the reason I felt I had this kind of urge to get into university so I could get the tools, learn the words, learn the concepts, study sociology and other social sciences, rather naively as I thought, but because I wanted to write, as I considered for the first time, an account of the people I'd come from and the world I'd come from that was sort of true, that wasn't full of cliches or dismissive theories about, what did they used to call it, the culture of poverty and all that, when we were never poor. My dad would do 3 or 4 jobs. But it was like, I felt that I'd come from a place that had not been really given full justice. One thing I must say, and this is, I think, is something I often emphasize when I'm talking to Americans. I have plenty of American friends, is that blue collar in America and working class are not the same thing. Blue collar in America somehow describes your worldly position, what you do for a living, your income and all of that. Working class in England, in Britain generally, is something much deeper and older. And it pertains to a form of kind of social consciousness and life world stuff, deeper things. Like, you can, let's think of an example. Rod Stewart, Paul McCartney, these kinds of guys, right? They are sirs, they're knights of the realm. They're super rich by our standards. They're very celebrated around the world, these people. Maybe only boomers will get this stuff about Rod Stewart, but they both make, and there are plenty of these guys, they always make reference, sooner or later they will make a reference in an interview and they will say, oh, well, I'm just a working class kid from Liverpool. Or Rod Stewart will say, well, I'm just a working class guy from London. I like to have a good drink on a Friday night. I'm working. So the accumulation of wealth, the changes in their status. I mean, I always thought that was just talk and they were just trying to sound like cool and they're down with the normal people. But I actually think it's real, because inside them somewhere is a kind of a consciousness or a way of feeling which comes from this very deeply embodied, grounded world. And so the next thing is that, so I felt very strongly that I came from such a world, and that the world of, in Britain, this is always to do with class. In Britain, the class thing goes very deep. And one way or another, it always resurfaces. Even though the social structure might change, the culture changes, sooner or later in Britain, the class thing always comes up again. It's up again now. It's very present now this week, because this whole thing in Britain, to my mind, is about the white working classes finally saying, well, no more of what you've done to us. No more of this suppression of us. So the reason I went to university, to go back to that, was that I just felt that somehow I wanted to take the experience of having come up in such a world and sort of translate it or transpose it into a different world or a different medium, from the embodied to the abstract, from the embodied to the abstract world. In the end, I concluded that it couldn't be done, but I gave it a try.
Right.
And so what I really wanted to do was sort of do what a lot of people do these days. I just felt that the kind of group I came from was very, very stereotyped, and I wanted to go more deeply into it and try and account for why they were the way they were. Now, I will just say one or two things. My dad was a lorry driver.
Yeah.
Truck driver. Some of my uncles, one of my uncles in particular, was a gangster professional back in the 50s. Early 60s, when being a professional criminal was still like a proper career. He would blow up safes. He was like a gelignite or dynamite. What is it? What do you say? Gelignite or dynamite? He blew safes up.
Yes.
I came from a world where there were kind of professional crime and doing jobs like being a truck driver or being a docker down by the river, fairly close from where I came from. That was the world, so there was like proletarian work, and there was sort of crime. And one of the things I wrote about in the book, and it pertains to the Millwall stuff, is that those two worlds were never completely separated. Like in much of the country, you were a respectable working class person, or you were like a criminal, a kind of peripheral, marginal scum type person, like a criminal. Where I come from, and it's quite hard to explain, you would have to read the book.
No, I understand.
They merged.
Yeah,
they were merged into a thing where these two parts hadn't been disaggregated,
right,
for historical reasons,
right,
to do with early modernity and all that stuff. So one of the things I was trying to explain was that, and this is why I was trying to do something original. I was trying to explain a form of social consciousness which you call working class in the sociology books, but is much more complicated than that. And I felt that nobody had ever really done it, and that was my ambition when I wrote the Millwall book. So the book wasn't really about football. It was taking those guys as a sort of case study in a complex form of social life and social consciousness that hadn't been properly written about, because most sociologists of class were very left wing and always saw that through a political lens, which I didn't. Right. I said politics doesn't matter here. All this stuff about class cultures in Britain is coming through the prism of class and how much they suffer and how much. And I wanted to somehow not do that, if you know what I mean.
Yes. So your description of like blue collar and crime and how they're kind of wedded together. There's this movie with Victor Mature, and he plays a lorry driver.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about?
In England, he's set in England. The film. It's a British movie.
And he has this smoking hot affair with Diana Dors.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it really captures kind of what you're talking about. Although he's not English himself, but he's like enmeshed in this world of trucks and crime.
Yep.
And there's really no distinction between the two.
Yeah.
The other movie that really gets into it, but from a different place in the hierarchy, is this movie called The Plowman's Lunch with Jonathan Pryce. Have you ever seen that?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, that's worth watching, because he plays a journalist, and he starts to see himself kind of moving through the journalistic world and making connections with people that are, kind of, higher in the hierarchy, like, peerage class. Right. And eventually he like hits this, plexiglass wall, and then he realizes like who he is. And not only does he realize who he is, he's made to realize who he is.
Of course, yeah.
Right. And I think Tim Curry is in the movie, and he reminds him, like, you know, you can't go beyond where you're basically allowed to go. It's actually a really good movie.
Can I just say, I got
Yeah.
a really early lesson in that when I went to school. I went to school in what's called a grammar school in England, which is a better kind of school than the standard kind of not state school. And I went, and you could get to such a school. This was supposed to be, they were modeled on the old public schools, the elite schools. And, but they were day schools. And you could get a place in one if you were like a local working class kid by doing very well in an exam called the 11 plus when you were 11. We switch over. So to cut that long story short, I ended up going to a very good school, kind of elite school. But as soon as I got there, I saw that they had 3 classes, 3 streams, A, B, and C, 90 kids in the year, 3 groups of 30. All of the local working class kids were in group C. And we'd been kind of, there was a form of kind of class apartheid was in operation.
Interesting.
The kids in A and B were taught Latin. We weren't. The kids in A and B would like play more rugby, whereas we played football, which is a class difference in England.
Right.
And so we were just treated very differently. And I saw it very early. I saw it when I was 11 or 12, and it made me furious. And to talk of movies, do you know the Lindsay Anderson film movie If? You know,
yes,
Lindsay Anderson?
Yes, absolutely.
Movie,
Lucky Man is amazing.
Yeah, so but if you watch If, it shows you, and it kind of became like a model for me. I became very aware of that ceiling or that wall as an 11 or 12-year-old, and it made me very angry and coloured everything that happened afterwards.
Wow.
And what I went in for was a kind of civil disobedience. I just refused to participate in the academic life of the school. So I started out getting into trouble for being a little bit hooliganish, but that didn't really suit me. So what I did was I just wouldn't do the work. And this went on for 4 years. And my poor parents, God bless their souls, spent 4 years just tearing more my mum than my dad. My dad wasn't so worried. Tearing my mum, because every year I would come bottom of the class in the class grading. And what I was doing, and I was partly under the influence of If, which is a very interesting movie. It's a different kind of school, but it's a film about this kind of very Edwardian or Victorian seeming institution in which some of the students stage a kind of guerrilla war against it. And I did that in my own way, just by not refusing to participate. So I withdrew my
attention.
I withdrew my agreement to participate in the thing, and I didn't cause trouble. I just sat at the back of the class every week and read all the rock music newspapers. And I kind of came to an agreement with my teachers. They would just leave me to do what I wanted to do at the back of the class, as long as I didn't cause any trouble, which I never did really. So what's the point? So this weird school experience explains why I left school when I was 16, and my very ambiguous and weird relationship with academia, because I was the worst student imaginable by design. Because I saw
at least you were conscious of it. You were conscious of it.
I saw that wall or that ceiling.
Yeah.
When I was about 12 years old. It was built into the structure of the school I was at.
Right.
And in a way, that sort of coloured much of what happened after. You know, I left school when I was 16, and the rest is the kind of things I've been telling you. But the class thing is always there.
Yeah.
It's always there, even though the form of it mutates, the forms of expression of it can change. It's always there. And if you understand that, it gives you an insight into what's happening, I think, in England this week. Right. It's always there. What's happening in England is a class thing.
It is a class thing.
Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about your migration to Millwall. And you grew up a fan, right? And then they have this very aggressive fan base. And to be clear, you're not at the apex of it. You're kind of in the outer sort of rings of it, but you're part of it. Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and tell people how you became? It's almost like, I'll go join that army for a while. How did you get there, and what was that like when you got there?
It was my dad started to take me and my brothers to Millwall when we were kids. They were our local team. I got into it more when I was like 13, 14. I started to go to games independent with my friends rather than with my dad. And then I have to tell you, let's set it like this. In the Millwall Football Club, which was quite an obscure, small football club, still is, in an obscure part of London, and my book is about the connection between the obscurity of the football club and the obscurity of that part of London, even though it's very central to the centre of the city. It's like a city. It was like a city within a city, and I just started. Once I started to go when I was 13 or 14 with friends, I got caught into the exhilaration of. Well, let's just say it straight. You go to Twitter, you go to YouTube, you go to your social media, there's chaos everywhere in the world. You see people running up and down the streets and there's chaos. They do that because it's exciting and it's pleasurable. Now, when I look at Twitter, I see most of the people doing the running up and down. I disagree with them and their politics or something. But really, I discovered the pleasures, of strong membership of a group. See, there were never that many people involved, a couple of hundred people at most, really, in the so-called hooligan formation. It's quite a small club with a small number of people, 300, 400 at tops. So a number of things come together. One is in the 1970s, Millwall went 59 games unbeaten at home. Unbeaten. For a long time, it held it was the club with the longest running unbeaten run. Later on, Arsenal took it over, and that's because opposing players and the fans of the players were afraid to come there. So the players didn't get support from their own fans, and the players were waiting for something kind of bad to happen on the pitch or something. And so it tended to suppress the spirits of visiting teams.
Right.
And so you really felt like you're a member of something very special, because your reputation, I mean, I was never that much of a tough guy, but I could go away from the ground, away from a game, and define myself as a Millwall fan. And that got you a kind of recognition. Yeah. A respect, which I didn't deserve, but who's to know? It's to do with the power of the symbol. And so it was fun. And I think the most important thing was a week or two ago, I'm not sure, you were talking in one of your shows about ordeal, trials by ordeal for young men.
Yep.
And that was really it. So so in those days, in the 1970s, which is what I'm talking about, there was major violence at football games every week in Britain. It was just almost a normalized thing. There would be major pitched battles, confrontations, and quite serious violence on a regular basis at dozens of stadiums on a given Saturday. And so what I discovered, I became addicted to going to away games. So you would go from London to one of the places that were in the news last weekend, those northern working class cities in Manchester, Bolton, Stoke, all of those kinds of places that were in the headlines last week for having so-called riots against whatever was going on. So the thing that I became sort of addicted to was you form up with a kind of small army, maybe 200 guys. There's a kind of leadership of older guys. The elders are like in their 20s and 30s in those days, and a lot of kind of younger guys learning the ropes. You travel to the north of England, you go into a hostile environment, and you contend with the locals for their space in the stadium. Basically, it was called taking the end. You would try and get into the stadium, move the local hooligan guys out of the space, and stand in it. Right? Wow. That was pure, primitive, territorial contention with the locals. Right? So that was what you did. It was called taking the end, and for a long time, and that was just exhilarating. So you're going with a band of brothers. You're traveling into a very hostile. We always had this north-south divide in England. So when London fans go up to places like the northern cities, there's a lot of aggression and competitive kind of vindictiveness there. They don't like you because you're from London. You don't like them because they're northerners. It was all like that. Right. Tribal patterns of recognition. So you would go up there. You would get involved in all that. So it was exhilarating. And the moments where I didn't know it at the time, what really made it exciting was you were putting yourself into, because all of that culture of rites of passage, all the stuff we know about tribal groups, all the stuff you can read about in the anthropological literature is gone in our society. What I noticed later when I was writing the book is that people just spontaneously made up equivalents for themselves in all kinds of ways. You know what I mean? That makes them. So. Am I still on?
Hey, Gary, let me pause you right there.
Yeah.
I need to duck out and come back. I'll be back in about 15 seconds. Don't go away.
All right.
But this happens once a show. And
I know. I see it. Yeah.
We've now come upon it. So I'll be right back. And I want to revisit that point because I think it's a very, very interesting point to return to. Sorry, let me get out of here. So what you are referring to is what Carl Jung talks about.
Yeah.
And Carl Jung talks about if we don't have these rites of passage, our subconscious will create them in one form or another, right? So for you and your culture, these were the assembled tools or the tools that you had at your disposal.
Yes, exactly.
That makes total sense.
It makes total sense. And when I came to read Jung and the anthropological literature, I was, okay. But it kind of organically and spontaneously, we created those things. And the ordeal would look like, you were describing something like walking a hot coal, going into potentially very dangerous situations, not running away,
right?
Not showing fear, standing up tall. I mean, I never wanted to get too close to the violence, but you can't be seen to be backing away from it either, because there's a taboo against that, because there's very tight in-group cohesion.
Right.
There may be 100 of you in a city full of thousands of your opponents, and if you don't stick together in a very tight group where everybody can be depended on and nobody takes a backward step, you're out of the group.
Right.
And you're probably going to get a slap on the train on the way home to make the point.
Right.
So I was never particularly violent or strong or a force to be reckoned with, but I also learned what I got from those experiences. I mean, you find yourself in a back street in somewhere in Liverpool on a cold Tuesday night with no train home, because whatever's happening, and there are just a small group of you. By learning, by kind of conforming to the requirements of the ritual, which is not showing fear, not running away when you really want to run away, and just disappear, melt into the shadows, but be there for the event and go through it, and then come away from it, and either on the bus or the coach or the train on the way back, have the kind of after ritual, which is the really bonding thing.
Right.
We've been through a great ordeal, and we've come out of it. We've either come out on top or we've given a good account of ourselves, and here we are.
Right.
So the very conscious, I'm not conscious, but a very real sense of putting yourself through an ordeal, meeting its demands, and coming. And this was very fortifying.
Sure.
Very, very fortifying. And actually, I think it gave. I mean, I don't want to get too carried away. Sometimes people who shouldn't have got hurt. But as far as it was like contending groups of guys of similar mind who were engaging in these kind of ritualized activities and because there was real violence, I thought it was a pretty good organic kind of solution for the absence. I came to think this later, for the absence of the rites of passage and proper ritualized moves for young men through the kind of stages into adulthood. And it did me a lot of good. I think it made me It did something for me.
Sure.
For us.
Sure.
Everybody's telling you you're scum. The newspapers are full of the headlines. Your parents are, but we knew that we were doing something which was important.
Yeah.
Important.
Yeah.
I won't put another word on it. Important, necessary.
Well, so let's go here. In your research and hanging out with people from Millwall and trying to, get some kind of grounding, maybe some statistical analysis, whatever that you conclude from that, right? You run into this challenge with it. These guys don't really talk very much, right? They're not. So to me, when you come back on that train, right, and you come through it, the experience isn't one that's necessarily intellectualized.
No, not at all.
Right. It's something much more in the body and grounded, right?
Exactly. What you do is you drink beer, you sing songs, you do all of that with the other guy. That's what you do. You don't reflect upon it. The last thing you do is reflect upon it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So this was the whole problem with doing the research in the book. So years later, I'm telling you now stories about when I was 14, 15, 16, maybe 17. I got out of it when I was 17 because I got beat up and I thought, no, I'm not doing that. And then the Sex Pistols showed up, so I went there instead.
Let's talk about the Sex Pistols. Let's break out a can of Sex Pistols.
Can I just make this point first?
Sure.
Point is that the whole weirdness of going to university and doing a PhD about this stuff is that you just can't put those two things together. The lack of any necessity to reflect on it or make sense of it or analyze it, the experience, I mean. And then you're in a world where everything has to be reflected on and analyzed and accounted for and described. You're going from a world that doesn't describe itself, the experiences that you're having in those football games.
Yeah.
And I actually had it was very, very weird. And I found it was almost enough to give me some kind of breakdown because who am I? Am I a smart guy who reads books, who can account for himself, who can write books even, or write articles with all the long words in? Is that me? Or am I the guy who wants to drink the beer after the ordeal's over, after the trial is over with the guys? And I could never put those two things together. I couldn't solve that problem.
That gets back to the discussion that we were talking about earlier, right? Body, mind.
Yeah.
Or embodied, disembodied. We'll come back to Jung here for a second. One of Jung's friends, and I think he actually worked with him with psychoanalysis, was Richard Wilhelm, who wrote the Book of Changes in the I Ching. And Wilhelm started to confide in Jung that he had gone so deeply into Chinese and Taoist culture that he felt like he was losing himself.
Yeah.
And Jung warned him, and he said, you need to come back to your culture. You need to come back to where you originated from. And I don't think Wilhelm took him seriously. And Wilhelm winds up having a breakdown. So, I mean, you're kind of experiencing that, right? You're kind of in that Richard Wilhelm territory.
Yeah. I had to find a weird solution for it. My solution for that was not quite being able to have the original point to go back to, but not being able to survive or persist psychologically in the new environment, which was a class thing, really.
Yep.
And so my solution for that was just to come and live in I came to live in Poland for a kind of a complex of reasons.
Right.
Personal, but one of them was I thought, well, maybe I can just go and work in universities there and all this class stuff won't be around. I can just be a guy, an English guy from the University of London, which they thought rated quite high, which they thought something of 25 years ago here.
Right.
I thought, so my solution to that problem was I couldn't find a really satisfactory solution because there was not really any there to go back to, because the community I came from, by the time I finished the PhD, had largely dispersed. A lot of those people went to live in the suburbs from around the, it was a white flight type scenario from inner London.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't the same there anymore by the 1990s. The world I'd grown up in was kind of more or less gone or disappearing. I couldn't stay where I was because it just wasn't for me. It was driving me crazy. So my solution was just to withdraw myself from the environment altogether, thereby withdrawing myself from all of the class contradictions and weirdnesses, and getting onto it into a whole different area where none of that stuff would have mattered anymore.
Right.
Sounds quite extreme, but that was part of my rationale for leaving England, just to take that kind of psychological pressure and ridiculousness away,
In astrology, when there's two planets in opposition with one another in the chart, right, there's different ways to look at resolving the opposition. But one of the classic ways is called finding the midpoint. And you find that place in between the opposition. Yep. And that's what you did. You found the midpoint.
Yep, exactly. And I've been very happy with it ever since. It really changed everything for me for the better in that regard.
Fascinating.
I couldn't stay in the contradiction. I had to get out of it.
Right. I totally understand it. So I studied English literature in college. I never intended to be an English lit major. I started off doing like TV and radio broadcasting, and I had a weird experience kind of at a junior college level with that medium, and I said to myself, I don't want to do this. I don't like these people. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I went to university, and I met up with this really eccentric woman. And we were not lovers or anything, but she was really eccentric and really brilliant. And I liked hanging out with her. And I'm like, well, what's your major? She goes, well, I'm an English major. I'm like, well, maybe I should do that. So I got into being an English major, and that kind of thrust me into that world, right, in academia. In fact, Naomi Wolf's father was a professor at my school where I went to college. I went to one of the, I got probably the best value out of my education per dollar than I don't know anybody I know, right? Because at my college, the teachers were Naomi Wolf's father. We also had she had left just before I got there. Anne Rice, who wrote Diary of a Vampire, Frances Mays, who wrote Under the Tuscan Sun. So we had a lot of heavyweights, but it was a state school, right? So it was really affordable. And I by the time I was graduating, I got really good at it, right? I had found my niche, and then I thought to myself, well, what do I want to do with this? Do I want to get a master's degree? Do I want to teach this stuff? And I just looked at all the teachers and the academia, and I just knew that I was going to be too nuts for it, right? Like, and this is San Francisco, and they were pretty fluid. Like, I would talk about Jung, and I would talk about mythopoesis and some of these concepts that were just really starting to come online, and they were open to it, right? They were very open to it. But even then, I felt like at some point I'd hit this wall.
Yeah.
And so I decided not to do that. So I can understand where you're coming from, and I really admire the fact that you went through, because you could have said, "Oh, fuck this," right? I can see where this is headed. But just like your Millwall experience, you went all the way through it.
I stayed with it. I stayed with it because that needed to be finished. It needed to be done and finished.
Yeah.
The other problem I always had in the UK was with all the cultural Marxism stuff. I just found it. When I first arrived at university, when I was 27 years old, I'd done some reading. I'd read Solzhenitsyn and all of that. When I got there, I was really ready to look up to more learned and developed and evolved people than myself. And I just got Marxism.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what the hell is this?
Right.
What the hell is this? And it made me confused for a while, because I just more or less walked in off the street, and I assumed that they all knew more than me, knew better than me. It took me a while to figure that out, but I realize now, looking back, what I got was an indoctrination, not an education there.
Right.
And that's gotten much worse since. I mean, I've got one of my kids is in. Perhaps I shouldn't talk about that because she's still in the system. But yeah, it's a kind of. That was the other thing. There was the class stuff.
Yeah.
But there was also, but they are connected, because where I came from, it was, there was not much enthusiasm for the kind of.
So let's talk about this for a second, because Marxism is theoretically the solvent to the class issue, right? Theoretically, right? You embrace Marxism, and then it begins to eradicate these divisions between class. But that's not really the case. Not really the case, because the people who promote Marxism are still at the top of the class, right?
Yeah, they always are.
Yeah.
When I was there, the really smart ones could see. So that was 87, 88. The smart ones could see that Marxism was kind of done if they were looking at what was happening in the Soviet Union. So they all got into postmodernism and the post-structuralism and all these other weird kind of French.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother.
They kind of transitioned into that because Marxism, they could see Marxism wasn't going to work anymore.
Right. It's about the meaning of meaning, right? The meaning of meaning.
Yeah, which is nothing. Nothing means anything.
That's
so that was weird. And so that was something else that when later on in the period I was talking about just coming to Poland and getting away from the university, I found myself, it just was getting worse and worse. The kind of influence of all that stuff was getting worse. And it was just kind of intolerable, because again, I felt like there was one world, I'm from this world. I've been sort of partly shit back. And one of the really refreshing things about being in Poland at least for the first 15 years was there was none of that. No cultural Marxism, no foolish ideology masquerading in his education, just much more solid and down to earth and normal.
Right. There's a part of this in the English story or canon that really fascinates me, because it's almost like there's, at least post-war England, right? There's this underlying sort of trust and belief in Russia and the Soviet Union and Marxism because they helped defeat the fascists, right? And by defeating the fascists, that meant that England was not going to be under the rule of Hitler, the Third Reich, et cetera, et cetera. So it's almost like there's this weird bond that happens between the people and then this ideology, right? And I always felt like the Kim Philby story was, that part of England's relationship to this distilled, right? So he's willing to sell the country out, give away government secrets, because he believes that it's a better system, and that system actually helps save the English people, right? So he has this kind of idealism that he's aligned with the Soviets.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is fascinating. And to me, it really represents this. It's almost like a Stockholm syndrome in some ways.
Yeah.
Right. Are you? Have you ever thought about that along those lines?
I've thought about it a lot. I mean, I think that what you're talking about is not the people somehow sympathizing with the Soviet Union, but it's elite intelligentsia sympathizing with the Soviet. I mean, Britain was full of communist fellow travelers in that period. Yeah. And I think part of their love of the Soviet Union, you can read all of this in like John le Carré novels. Their attachment to the Soviet Union was connected to their contempt for England.
Wow.
Maybe because to do with their status as being higher up. And we're seeing it all now again. Keir Starmer is a pure product of this, the Fabian Society and all of that. And I think that was really an elite thing. The love of the attachment to the Soviet Union. That was Cambridge and Oxford. It was people for whom, Orwell wrote, didn't he, very famously in the 40s, that England is the only major country in the world in which its intellectual classes despise their own country. It's a very peculiarity about England specifically, and we see it now, that tendency is more or less taken over, which is why what's happening now in England is happening, is that there is the English kind of culture and intellectual elites would side with the Soviet Union partly because for idealistic reasons, but partly because of hatred of England and the English. It's a very, very peculiar cultural psychology, and it's very specifically English in a way, I think. And it probably has a multiple.
No. We're getting that here in this country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We're getting the same treatment.
You get this loathing of the people, and now we talk to the opposite of this being attached to people. You talk about this pathological loathing of the people that have produced you.
Right.
And you're and becoming fixated on a kind of an opponent or an antithesis to it, like Soviet communism or this other nonsense we're being persecuted with now in terms of left ideologies. So I think that a large part of I think you could draw a line between the moment you're talking about, the post-war moment. I mean, do you know much about the Fabian Society?
Yes.
Right. So that's a plan for the long term. You know, Marxist it's the first cultural Marxism, I think, before the Frankfurt School, before Antonio Gramsci, later in the, and it's the idea that okay, well, let's not have a revolution, at least in England, because they don't want a revolution. They're not like that. They're like hobbits. They don't really want a revolution. But if we spread it out incrementally over a long, it's the boiling frog.
Yep.
Right? I think the Fabians came up with the boiling frog idea, which is just do a little bit incrementally over time. And before you know where you are, you can stage an international socialist kind of system, make a one world internationalist socialist system before people have even realized it's happening. And I think that's where we are, getting close. And if you look at Tony Blair, which was a big turning point in this story in Britain, he was a Fabian. Well, they were all, I mean, the list of really, Woodrow Wilson and Captain House and all that, his handler, they were Fabians. So one of the things I think is a problem for me, it's like an emotional problem, is that I see these people in England on the street protesting. Some of them are starting to wake up and smell the coffee and do some research, but most of them don't know that what's happening to them now is part of a long Fabian Society, Rockefeller Foundation, whatever plan. We know all that stuff. The nation states have got to go.
Yep.
The nation states have got to be collapsed from the inside.
Yep.
As a prelude to some kind of international or world system. So there's something tragic about watching people with all their heart and soul trying to defend and save something. Let's say what we used to think of as English culture or the English way of doing things. And at the same time, not knowing. I mean, I'll give you the example that comes to my mind is I paid quite a lot of attention to the tell me if I'm getting off topic. I don't think I am.
No, we're on.
The United Nations Compact on Safe and Orderly Migration, 2018. Now, what that showed you, and there are no conspiracies here. Well, there is conspiracy, but the theory is that we're now looking at a program of managed population transfer from the global south into the north. In your case, from Central and South America. In our case, from Africa and Middle East.
Well, we're getting the Africans and the Middle Easterns too.
Yeah, and now you're getting all of it. You're getting the kind of the full. So not enough people realize. They somehow think that this is a sort of an accident. It's bad judgment on the part of Keir Starmer and Tony Blair and Rishi Sunak. They're incompetent. I think we and the people who are watching this stream kind of know what's going on.
Right. I mean, they will point the finger at every other reason or example or justification instead of the one that is staring them right in the face.
Yep.
And that is, this is intentional.
Yep.
It is happening to destroy your culture.
Yep.
It is happening to destroy your rights. Right. And these are the two fundamental things that you need to understand. And everything else is a complete and utter distraction.
Yes, except for one thing. In the English case, I completely agree with that. And more people are starting to either see it or intuit it, but without necessarily having the information. But so the one way of looking at this is, if you don't turn this into an ethnic war, don't turn this into a racial war, just focus on the elites that are, focus on the people that are making this happen. I get that. On the other hand, what do you do if you're in England and you've got these deep and profound and like perpetual problem with the kind of the so-called grooming rape gangs? Right. The various problems in terms of social disaggregation and conflict. I mean, I follow this, so I knew things were going to get very bad in England. Can we talk about England for a little while?
Absolutely.
I knew things were going to get very bad, and now it's all of a sudden it's happening, and it's kind of making my head spin a bit.
Yep.
We've seen Muslim gangs, armed militias patrolling town centres, small town centres mostly, or Birmingham's a big town, with the police hiding or tactically withdrawing into like McDonald's car park and not getting involved. Right? So this is really serious situation there.
So let's clarify this. Let's clarify this. So the armed militias are the imports.
These are as it transpired at the weekend in those small northern towns in England. They are, on the whole, part of the Pakistani communities in those towns. Yeah,
right. So they're imports, and they're armed. Which, if anybody knows anything about England, having arms is very difficult.
No, we don't have arms, and I was surprised at how quickly that happened, because I think we just saw a real turning point when we saw a pointer towards the future, which is a really balkanized country, where Muslims are going to have to live in and patrol their own areas. You look at the demographics, you look at the birth rates. We've known that for a long time,
right?
But we know, and so in a slow motion, piece by piece, you know that over time England's going to become much less English, and that's all going to happen. But seeing these guys walking around in town centres like in Stoke, in Bolton, they've got machetes on display, which is absolutely outrageous in the English context. Yep. Knives, baseball bats. You can see 100 clips of this, 50, and it's not addressed by the state. Gives you an indication of where the country's going, I think.
Oh, the state's complicit. They're complicit.
Absolutely. The state is literally, we've all got all this stuff now about two-tier policing. The state is absolutely complicit.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the people have got so hot under the collar, because it's outrageous. And so,
well, I mean, here's the most difficult part.
I think on the one hand,
they have nobody. They have nobody to turn to.
No, they're on their own.
That's right.
The white working class. I'm going to say this. It's too late not to say things. The white working class people of England are on their own. They have no support in the institutions, in the political class, the political system, in the culture, in the education system, in none of the social institutions. They are on their own, and they've just realised it. I think that's what this last week was about. They're just realising that they're on their own. The whole thing is now set up for a different England, for a different Britain, with different values, different characteristics coming into the future, and they are now surplus to requirements. That's how I see it. And they're starting to understand that we've become surplus to requirements in our own country.
Right. All of a sudden, England is now Rhodesia.
In a nutshell.
Yep.
And these people out on the streets last week who weren't far right. There is no far right in England. They don't have a far right in England. That's just made up like it is to some extent. You might have more far right type guys with guns where you are, but we don't have much of that in England. And I don't just say you do. I say, but I think the far right stuff is a straw man or a bogey man. And I think that what you saw last week was people in England starting to realise they're in a real existential struggle for survival as a people.
Absolutely.
Because they've got the full forces of the state now arrayed against them.
That's right.
We've got two things coming up which I would like to mention, which is why I'm not surprised at all. I think Starmer triggered all of this because the government's got two things they're really itching to get done in the early phase of the one is that we've got this thing called the Online Harms Bill, which is all about really drastic draconian control of the internet in the name of censorship, misinformation and hate. And they've been itching to get that through, and that's ready now. It's in the so-called consultation phase, which I think means they're just waiting for a pretext to put it into
They've
play.
got it all. They have it all down.
And the second thing is Starmer's really itching to do this. He wants to introduce new legislation which will make it a crime to make critical comments about Islam. So they've also got blasphemy laws, just waiting to be brought in. So I reckon quite soon in England, within the next year certainly. We'll see if I'm wrong. We'll see if we can still have these conversations in a year's time.
Yep.
You're going to see blasphemy laws, which is so if there's some trouble, if there's some kind of new rape gang case coming up, you won't even be allowed to discuss it. And the internet in Britain will become very heavily censored. Right. It's already started. I read earlier, there's a woman who's just got 40 months in prison for something she wrote on Facebook. I don't know what she wrote. There's a guy just got 26 months for shouting at a policeman.
For just shouting at him.
Well, I guess he was up close and kind of spitting and frothing at the mouth and getting a bit out of control. But he didn't lay a finger on the policeman.
Right.
He's got 26 months. So things are headed in a kind of a very serious direction there now. And it was kind of, I think before there was a policy of like containment.
Yeah.
You know? Let's try and keep things looking like they're halfway normal until it's too late. But I think Starmer, for some reason, is accelerating it.
In as much as there is the draconian limitations of speech, right? This is also like a psychological operation.
For sure, yeah.
And it is being created to absolutely crush and demoralize the English people.
Yep. And humiliate.
Yep. I think that this is a travesty. And, I like I said on Sunday night show, I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a solution. I wish I could bring over a ship of, good old boys with some AR-15s, some shotguns, right, and some good communication, and take care of some business. But what do you think? What do you think can be done?
Well, not very much, I'm afraid to say. But at that level, I would return to an earlier phase of our conversation, which is at the personal level. Now the kind of the spiritual realm, the realm of prayer and transcendence of worldly affairs is becoming. That sounds like running away. I think that we have to go. I think that things are going to. I don't know how things get better, but we've got to go through some. This goes to the bigger picture that we've really been. It's been signaled since COVID. I think we've got to go through some very bad stuff.
Yeah,
which you've talked about plenty of times.
Yeah,
we've got to go through. And now here we are. I think now we're in the case of England, and I'm saying England. It's not Scotland. It's not England and Northern Ireland. Not much Wales or Scotland. We're in the shitstorm. The shitstorm is really approaching now, and I don't know. I just don't know about that. I in the longer run, I think things are fine because I think we'll be delivered by this from the grace of God, and but that's a long run. I think in a way, I think this, I've got much more in the recent period into, the biblical prophecy. We're coming into the time. It looks like we're coming into the time of the Antichrist, for sure.
It feels like all the elements are.
Yeah. I mean, they don't. Those biblical prophecies don't give you a timeline. But first, before you get to the apocalypse, you get the time of the Antichrist. I think we're getting there now. So I think maybe it was always going to be this way. I think maybe these guys at the World Economic Forum and all these clowns kind of think they know that things somehow have to really change, but they think they can manage it, but they don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And because they're just what they are. But I think maybe this massive and deep change in the kind of human experience and condition was always going to happen.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, it's one possibility. I don't know. Who knows?
I feel like the only chance, maybe not the only chance, but the one that comes to mind for me is something along the lines of V for Vendetta, where people kind of culture hack, right? They culture hack the system, whether it's through the computer systems themselves, CCTV, right, shutting things down. To me, that's the only real operational potential, right? And with stuff like that, if you're going to do that, you have to make it really count, right? Because you can only get away with it about 3 or 4 times before they cinch up. I mean, I think this is a very interesting discussion we're having, right? Just in terms of like a battlefield and a war front, right? The English people are in a war. Make no mistake about this. They're in a war. And they're just waking up to the fact that they're in a war.
Yep.
Now, in a war scenario, right, there is always adaptation. And there are always countermeasures and things that can occur, but those things can't occur until people find out that they're in a war.
Yeah.
Right. So now that that's on the table,
yeah,
and the sooner that the English people understand this, the faster that they can begin to think about countermeasures, like being on the streets and taking these guys on face to face is not going to work, right? It is not going to work because, number one, you may not have the numbers, you may have the heart, like Millwall, right? But you may not have the numbers. And number two, you're going to be the ones that are going to be prosecuted for basically standing up for your own rights, your own property, your own family, and your own progeny. So this face-to-face thing is not going to work.
No, the face-to-face thing is not going to work. Although I think you're right. One thing, Tolkien said, I will paraphrase. He said the English may lack imagination, but they have very deep reserves of character and resilience when pushed.
I agree. So I think this moment of face-to-face is important.
Get things rolling.
That's
right. I think it was very important this week. Whatever happens next, I think this week was very important because now the English people have got a new kind of sense of their own collective destiny and existence as a group.
That's right.
To go back to Marx. Marx, what did Marx say? You go from a class in itself to a class for itself. So you just exist in a group, and then all of a sudden you get a collective self-awareness that's new, and you act on that basis.
Right.
I think the English are just reaching I would say the kind of, generally speaking, the English people are just reaching that point of thinking that they better stop. It's time to stop getting drunk, watching the football, getting your nails done, watching porn, and playing games, and just get a bit more serious and realize that you are in a war as a collective, and figure out how that war could be conducted.
They need to really look at this asymmetrically.
But the face-to-face stuff has to happen because the emotions are in the embodied.
That's right. I totally agree. Totally agree. Again,
and now something else.
We're weaving back and forth between this idea of being viscerally engaged.
Yes.
Right. And then what do you do with that? Well, then you collect your information and you say, okay, based on everything we've just experienced, right? This is kind of if we continue to do this, it's a no-win situation.
Yes.
People will get hurt. We'll lose numbers.
You'll go to prison for 26 months for shouting.
Right. Exactly. And then you'll be persecuted and prosecuted.
Yeah.
So now that we know that we're in this, we got to be smart about this. And we have to find ways in which we can monkey wrench the system and take this to an asymmetric level. And I think that will happen. I do think so.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of smart people in Britain. I mean, they've been kind of demoralized and forced into much more privatized and hedonistic forms of living.
Yeah.
But I think now maybe we can come out of that phase now, and get more serious.
You have to.
And do what you're saying. There's plenty of smart people there.
Yep.
For God's sake, I mean, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Also, the other side always has to be restated, I think, which is that these so-called powers that be are not as clever and never as clever as they think they are. They always take too much on. There are so many moving parts to this idea for a kind of a one world technocratic government. There's really a lot to go wrong there. There's probably a lot of spokes you can put into that. There's a lot to be done to exploit the fact that it's such a complex and hubristic idea that they're just going to control all of us.
Yeah. No. So if I were incredibly devious, which sometimes I can be, this is what I would do. Now, of course, you're hearing some of this chatter come out of England that the Muslim community is now going to go after the Jewish community. I don't know if you've seen this or not.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, the threatened. Yeah.
And if this is me from an asymmetric perspective, with whether or not you are firmly, deeply rooted and entrenched in this belief, if you were the English culture, right, you would say to the Muslims, "Hey, you know what? We're with you on this. We're going to be on. We're going to be in lockstep with you. We're going to be on your side, right?" And now you have like this kind of mind fuck with Keir Starmer and all the rest of the English Fabian society wonks. It's like, what did we do now? We just created a two-headed monster, right? And I think that would be probably Tommy Robinson may not agree with me, but that would be, I think, the most asymmetric thing. So just, hey, salaam alaikum. Your enemy is our enemy. Let's sit down and have a powwow. And
that's a nice idea, but I see a problem with it, which is that now for decades, the British establishment, Tony Blair, nobody's talking about this at the moment. You go back 15 years, people were speculating on whether Prince Charles had converted.
Right.
So attached was he to Islam. Yep. Blair and the Labour Party, his government was full of Fabians. And there were literally like a couple of hundred of them almost. 200 was the figure I saw. And what the establishment has done is it's stitched Islam already into the fabric of the society to Muslims' advantage.
Yes.
If you look at we've got something like 10 mayors of Muslim cities now, Muslim cities of mayors of Muslim cities. Right. We've got a long period of the state and the political organs of the state and the social institutions doing a lot of like so-called community work and drawing in and supporting. You see now the police. You saw it this week. The police are all over supporting the Muslim.
Yes,
which they can be. I mean, as long as things are even-handed. But I think that we've now had quite a long period where the Muslim population of Britain has been brought quite close to this, to the state, to the kind of centers of political and social power.
Mm-hmm.
And they're pretty well dug in now. And I think quite satisfied. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, talks about how afraid he is. Why is he afraid? He's the mayor of London. Nobody's ever tried to hurt him. He's done everything he wanted. The society has opened up and let him do whatever he wanted. He's not in any danger. You know what I'm trying to say?
Sure.
So I think that by design, the British kind of state and its institutions have really worked hard to bring the Muslim population in close and assist them.
Right. So what you're saying is that they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
I would say exactly that.
Okay.
Especially with a Labour government in power. You noticed that Keir Starmer yesterday. Keir Starmer hasn't been to see the parents of those 3 girls that were killed. Not that necessarily has anything to do with Islam. I got the feeling Starmer made it about Islam.
Right.
But he's been to mosques. He's been to talk to community leaders. And he's reassuring them. He hasn't been to visit the parents of those girls that were slaughtered in Southport about a week ago, was it? Seems like time is getting weird. So I think that this clearly demonstrated support for the Muslim community in Britain is now on the part of the state institutions and the kind of political class is very well established going back some decades. And I think that is an issue that needs to be taken into consideration.
It's interesting. It feels like the English have this kind of romantic love affair with Islam going back to Lawrence of Arabia, right?
Exactly, yeah.
T. Lawrence.
Again, I wouldn't say the English. I would say the elite English.
The elite English, yeah.
Lawrence of Arabia. I read a very interesting thing a few years ago, which said that when the Foreign Office in Britain is notoriously Arabist. They're all, they're absolutely pro-Arab, which why not? But I read that when Britain were in control, along with France, of the Middle East, that the English gentlemanly elite really liked the Arabs because they had good manners. They were meeting Arab chieftains. More importantly, for the English, who were obsessed with sport and always used sport as an instrument of colonial policy, like cricket and all the rest of it in India.
Right.
They really liked the Arab leaders because the Arabs seemed to be courteous and kind of very dignified like them, but also love sports, especially if horses were involved.
Very much.
And they formed this emotional connection with like the Arab elites a long time ago.
Interesting.
And, yeah, you have this very strong connection between certain sections of the British elite, which you see it in the Foreign Office and the leadership of the Arab world, and pro-Arabic culture, which is very interesting. Yeah, so that precedes all of this stuff about migration. It goes back to the colonial period.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
all right.
Yeah.
Can we talk some Sex Pistols here?
Sure.
Okay. Let's do this. We got about half an hour left.
Okay.
Let's talk about the Sex Pistols and punk rock.
Sure. Yeah, that'll be a relief.
Yeah, and I do want to end on the latest aspects of your work with virtuality and getting lost in the virtual world. And then we'll maybe circle back a little bit with the body, the visceral, the primary experience. Okay. Punk rock, for me, like, I think we're close in age.
Yeah.
Right. And I was a big like rock and roll fan as a kid, and I was always looking for the next thing. Right. Like what, and in the 70s was such an exciting time to be alive when it came to music, because man, you could trip into a new genre, you know, like every couple of months. But for the most part, my thing was like American and English hard rock with the experimental edge. Like I was a big Bowie fan, Roxy music. Like I love that stuff. Right. And then on the American side, I had sort of, you know, the American rock. We didn't really have an experimental scene like that. You know, but we had a really good American rock scene, especially with bands like Montrose. I really love that stuff. Then I got into just before the Sex Pistols hit, I was really into this band from New York called the Dictators.
Yeah, and Handsome Dick Manitoba and the
Handsome Dick Manitoba. Love those guys. Saw them twice, and I'm like, oh, I'm digging these guys. I love these guys. And then I heard the Sex Pistols, and it was like the heavens opened, the skies parted. Right?
Yeah.
This is it to me. To this day, it is still the definitive archetypal rock album of all time. And the confluence of everything around that record at that time is incredible. And then what it does, right? People who may not be familiar with the Sex Pistols have this very interesting show. I believe it's in Manchester, and everybody says they were there at that time, but there were people there. The Buzzcocks were there. Mick Hucknall was there. There were some people at that show, right? And that performance in Manchester, Tony Wilson's there, and Tony Wilson says, "The hell with the past. This is the present. This is the future."
And that was where I got started, because Tony Wilson put him on So It Goes, his TV show.
That's right.
And I came in one Saturday night. My parents and siblings were in bed because that show used to run late. We never used to have very late TV in Britain in the 70s, but that show ran fairly late, past 11 o'clock. And I was there. And so just to go back a step, I was a complete music nut from the age of about 10. I was into a lot of the things you just mentioned, Roxy and Bowie. I was a big Led Zeppelin guy. I loved the Who. I loved all of it, really, all the good stuff. But then I think it was in 76, I went to see the Rolling Stones, a very famous concert in Nebworth Castle, supported by Leonard Skinner, which is when I got the Leonard Skinner bug, one of the best bands I ever saw.
Leonard Skinner is criminally underrated.
So, but there's a kind of story here, and I thought it was my story. I realized later it was a bigger story, which is so we had so much enthusiasm in the 70s, didn't we, for all that stuff? But the band started to really grow away from us and become a bit. So I remember being at Nebworth Park, where there's like 100,000 people there, maybe more. And it's not like it is now, where you go to a big festival and there are facilities. It's like you're in a massive field with 100,000 other people.
And not to mention the giant screens. There's no giant screens.
There's nothing there. If you want to have a piss, it takes you 15 to 20 minutes to get there. There's no refreshment, or very few refreshments on sale. You come back. So we're baking in the sun for the whole day because we're waiting to see the Rolling Stones. The day goes on and on and on, and it's like an hour later, and it's an hour and a half later, and they're backstage partying with John Paul Getty III in a castle, in a stately home. Right. And we're all sitting there, and in the end they come on, they're completely out of their heads. The show is shit because Keith can barely handle his guitar. And I left early as a Rolling Stones nut. This was 1976. And I had to sleep in a phone box and get back. It was just like that. And then I thought, and I realized, I learned subsequently in England, at least, Britain at least, a lot of us had a similar experience. What is this? What is this? And the band and I'd only been going to see bands in big venues, like the big bands, or I hadn't been going to clubs to see them.
Right.
And the guy said to me, "There's a band called Eddie and the Hot Rods. They're playing at the Marquee Club. Why don't you come along?" And I went. And all of a sudden, right before the Sex Pistols, in the 6 months before the Sex Pistols blew, I'd started to go to see a band called Eddie and the Hot Rods, who were just pure youthful, adrenaline fueled, real rock and roll. 3-minute songs. They're right there. You're here. They're there. And it was,
teenage depression.
We rediscovered like rock and roll music. Not
great band. Great band.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's all going on. So things are beginning to turn. I got beat up at a football match towards the end of the 1976 season. And I'm starting to think, well, maybe that's not such a great. I got beaten up in Cardiff, which was a rough town then in Wales. It was a Millwall game, and I was thinking, maybe will I go back next season for more? Or I was starting to come out of it.
Right.
And then, so basically, I don't know when it was. It must have been in around about, I don't know, June, July, something like that. Sometime that year, I'm sitting at home minding my own business. The TV comes on. The Sex Pistols came on to Tony Wilson's show, and I didn't even know where to put myself. I don't think I've ever been so exhilarated. I certainly hadn't been so exhilarated up until that point. And it's very hard to make this understandable to people now, I guess, younger people. But that presentation, that atmosphere, that energy just completely changed everything.
Absolutely.
The next day I cut all my hair off. I got a pair of my mum's big shearers, because I had hair down to here like Robert Plant. Robert Plant was my guy,
Right.
So I had hair like him. Right. So I cut it all off like Johnny Rotten.
Right.
Changed my wardrobe, tore my clothes up, put the safety pins in. And quite soon after that, there was the really famous show at the 100 Club in Oxford Street, which was the punk festival where the Sex Pistols played, the Clash played, and Susie and the Banshees played their first ever show. Paul Simon, the Clash's bass player, had little coloured stickers on the neck of his bass to show him where to put his fingers. That's how real.
That's how raw they were. That's how raw
they were. So I saw the Pistols, the Clash. And then everything changed. But that changed everything for about 18 months, and it changed. And I think the most notable thing about the punk thing was that a lot of the people that got involved with it were quite quickly turned into into directions they might never have taken culturally, if they hadn't been exposed to the Sex Pistols. Because Led Zeppelin were the Led Zeppelin, the Stones were the Stones, the Who were the Who, even Roxy Music, who were quite radical, experimentally. But my response to the Sex Pistols, it seemed to demand that you just couldn't go back to that stuff anymore. You couldn't go back to Led Zeppelin. You couldn't, as much as I love them, you couldn't go back to the Rolling Stones. I mean, I have since in my boomer reminiscences.
Yeah, right.
But I have a few beers and listen to the Stones, but generally it propelled you somewhere.
Yeah.
And this was it propelled you somewhere else. And so within a year, 18 months of seeing the Sex Pistols, I was into John Coltrane. I was reading, I don't know, Franz Kafka. It took you somewhere else, It unsettled you. It unsettled you, and you couldn't go back to your passive consumption habits from the previous period. That's what I found.
And you were there, so I'm experiencing it in America, which is a little bit different, right? You're like your ground zero where all this is happening. So the seismic effect is much greater, I think, in closer proximity. Mm-hmm. But from a cultural perspective, bringing astrology into it, John Lydon is an Aquarian, and and he does exactly what he is supposed to do. He goes out and he destroys all these forms.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that famous scene in 24 Hour Party People where they go back to the guy's apartment. He's ripping his posters down.
Yeah,
right?
it was
Has
like
to
that.
go.
Yeah.
Has to go.
It was like
And he
that.
gets to Bowie. He's like, has to go. Right?
Bowie was hard to let go, but I never really did with Bowie. But almost everybody else.
Oh, Bowie was I interviewed Bowie one time.
Oh yeah, I remember you talking about that.
Yeah.
He comes from South London, not that far from me. Bowie.
He was actually a very nice guy.
Yeah.
He was very cool. But man, it cannot be understated the impact that the Sex Pistols have on the world. Changes everything.
Really?
Changes everything. Fashion.
Yep.
Music. Downstream, you get more watered down sort of bands. Like there's no new wave without the Sex Pistols, right?
No.
But you're right. I mean, all those things that you talked about in terms of this this explosion and becoming open to Kafka and experimental films and
European films.
Right, exactly. I mean, and that was all part of it. It was really all part of exploring this kind of piece of the avant-garde that was being brought to you by this group that was incredibly avant-garde, but at the same time, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but at the same time, they're working class. Like Steve Jones is a working class dude, right?
Yeah, I think they all were, really.
Yeah, they all were.
Yeah.
So to me, that's where it gets really, and the album just it kicks ass. And I'm so glad they broke up and didn't do another record.
Yeah, I thought it started to go wrong when Sid Vicious came into the band. I think the first year or however long it was when Glenn Matlock was in the band,
right?
The band that recorded the album.
Yeah,
I thought Sid Vicious was kind of just some sideshow. I never cared for that, but they were really tight, great live band. But you've just put something else into my head now, and I would like to take it back to John Lydon, as we call him these days, is in the media all the time in England now saying controversial things, whether it's Brexit or immigration. He says those things. Morrissey, who's another guy I have very close to my heart, he says those things.
Yep.
Noel Gallagher, the Oasis guy, he says those things.
Ian Brown
is the main guy with that.
Ian Brown's my man.
Ian Brown is the guy. Yeah. He was the first one on the COVID thing. He was the very first person to deal with that. What have they all got in common? They're all working class guys from Manchester and London.
Yep.
They are, and it's just something interesting about that. Everybody else, even Roger Daltrey, was complaining about Brexit and saying that's the mafia. Let's get away from them. And Roger Daltrey was like a sheet metal worker before he was in the Who. Very working class guy, tough guy.
Yeah.
And so what I can't help noticing is if anyone opens their mouth on Brexit, on immigration, on various other things, it tends to be a celebrity rock star from very working class origins. I always think it's kind of a feature of the landscape.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just noticed it.
So I had an interesting discussion with a fellow astrologer on Twitter, and we're kind of going back and forth about astrological styles, astrological community, etc. And I said I never really cared about belonging in the astrological community. Like I could give two shits, right? And a lot of people, that's where they bond and form, and they have these professional associations, and I could care less. And he said to me, "You seem to me like you're a punk rock astrologer," and I took that as a compliment.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I would probably say that you're a punk rock academician, right?
Yeah. Which is a good thing to be, because it sounds like a constricting label, but actually it's the opposite. It's a label with a lot of kind of implicit meaning impacted in it, punk. Because it means a lot of things, and it means creativity and figuring just anarchic creativity and figuring.
There's a spirit of anarchic creativity.
Yeah.
Right. There's kind of a DIY thing that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And then there's always, at least for me, like, am I being a sellout? Right. Am I being a sellout? And I don't have to ask myself that question too often, right? But that's another part of this kind of quality control that goes along with it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
do you?
So in a peculiar kind of way, the football hooligan thing and the Sex Pistols thing were very constructively formative.
Yes.
Me as a young man, in a way that most people who don't know about, who don't think or talk in the way that we're talking, wouldn't be able to see. They were very useful and productive.
Well, and the Rolling Stones were the bad boys, right? They were little, you know, poshy, shocking, but they didn't hold a candle to the Sex Pistols.
No.
Like when the Sex Pistols were on that barge, you know, and they're singing "God Save the Queen."
77,
like,
yeah.
Nobody had ever done that before.
No, that was
right.
Wild.
Nobody had ever caused such a furor in the English culture than the Sex Pistols.
No, and I'll tell you a story. Nobody in the 60s had. So that all happened when I was doing all of those. I was working as a labourer with a small construction firm. When I say construction, like they were renovating houses, putting new walls in, stuff like that. And I went after there was you probably know about when they went on the Bill Grundy TV show.
Yeah.
And they swore. It was
Steve Jones let it rip.
Everything changed after that. And I went to work the next day with my jeans all torn up and a little kind of safety. My ears were pierced and I had a safety pin. I walked in and the foreman, the boss said to me, "You can fuck off. You're not working here anymore. Go home." And it was like that. It was such an intense thing that the kind of what these days I suppose we might rudely call the normies,
right?
Which is not a term I like, but they were really outraged. They were shocked. They were outraged. They were emotionally disturbed, and they were really quite aggressively vindictive to so-called punk rockers because I think
it was a threat to the social order.
It was really a threat to the social order in a way that the bands in the 60s and 70s hadn't been,
right,
or have been since.
Yeah,
it was a really funny thing because people just couldn't handle it. I remember the people working at the record plant when they were pressing Anarchy in the UK just wouldn't work. They went on strike. They said, "We're not making these products." You know, it was really a strong thing, and there was a very strong reaction to it. It was like some kind of weird tipping point.
Yeah.
From what I'm not sure. But it was, you could get beaten up. You would get beaten up in the shop. People would. I was okay because I'd been to Millwall. I knew a bit how to handle myself. I was walking around London with my friends, and we were like punks. People were always trying to attack. One kind would attack you. The police would pull you over, but you'd have to be ready. You know, people were very violently disposed towards you. You know, in 1976, 77 in London, if you wanted to look like that, you really had to be ready to wear the look. You know, and defend yourself.
Right.
So that was interesting, yeah. But it was it fractured something. It was some kind of massive kind of psychic break, energy of a new kind in the culture. I don't know. I still don't really understand.
I totally agree. Right.
And people just think they were the first punk band, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah. So much more than that. And then of course you have what I would call the ultimate commodification of the Sex Pistols, which ultimately becomes the Clash. And they play on stadium tours, right? And they're on tour.
Yeah, they came to the States and they wanted to be the new Rolling Stones. But to start with, first year, they were a hell of a band.
No, I agree. I saw their very first show in the United States. And the first place they played was in Berkeley because it was a communist town, right?
They've got their Sandinista t-shirts on.
This is way before.
That's pretty. They were good before that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is their first show in the U.S. and they had Bo Diddley open for them.
Yeah, I remember that. Uh-huh.
And I got to tell you, man,
that's cool. That's very cool.
That night with the Clash is one of the best concerts I've ever been to.
Yeah,
I mean, these guys were just full on, like fury and energy.
Yeah.
It was like, God, this is rock and roll,
right?
And I'm really glad I went there. Let's shift the conversation while we have a little bit of time left here to kind of what the opposite is. Now, I will say this as a bit of a disclaimer, because I do have a Gen Z son. And
I have a Gen Z daughter.
So I've been around them in this culture, right? And I think they're very interesting. At least the kids that
I have heard you talk about them.
At least the kids that I knew. In fact, you probably heard the story that one time my son was talking to his friend on the phone and he could hear me in the background at his friend's house because he was watching me, right? It was like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm listening to your dad. And I thought, good for him, right? So, and all these kids played sports, right? So yeah, they have their video games and they've got their phone stuff, but to this day, they still play sports. They grew up playing baseball, and football was a big part, because they have Gen Z parents, right? And I'm sorry, Gen X parents.
Mm-hmm.
And Gen X were very sporty types, right? So they're getting their kids to play sports. Yeah. So they do have some of this. And on the other side of it, there is this kind of larger virtual field, because they're the first generation that grows up fully with the internet.
Yeah.
So why don't we touch on that a little bit before we get on out of here, and then we'll bring it back to the visceral.
So the stuff I've just been doing in the last couple of years comes from a concern. So I'm very interested in technocracy. I'm very interested, in the attempt, which we're seeing again. This relates to what's happening in Britain this week. All the stuff that we're familiar with, the kind of digital ID, it's central bank, the kind of digital technocracy is what I've been calling it. And I am the last person to kind of want to beat up on Gen Z and say their hope, because I've got a daughter in the next room who's belongs there. But what concerns me, and I don't have answers to this, but I'm just really trying to raise some issues, is that and I think the situation is perhaps more acute when it comes to girls than boys, for a number of reasons.
I actually can I can support that, because I've seen that.
Yeah, you see it,
and not through my son, but through his girlfriend.
If you look at it, you see it.
Yes.
And what I'm concerned about is, as someone, so if you've got kids that age, you've had to fight the phone wars. I don't know what your stance is and all of that, but you've somehow got to try and deal with the fact that they're living in a very different world from you. And they're, I will say a couple of things, and they're not very conclusive, but I will tell you what my concern is.
Sure. My
concern is that over the last, I don't even know how long, 20 or 30 years, I subscribe to the theory that we've seen a real dumbing down of the culture and dumbing down of the education system.
Yep.
And if you really look now, and we've got, what have we got? We've got a thing called the knowledge gap, which is that if you look at people now in their late teens and and I'm in contact with such people in my work, you find that what people of our age used to call general knowledge, that's gone. They don't know things. On the whole, They don't really know stuff. I don't know if that matters or not, but I always thought it mattered. I thought it mattered if you know something about history, you know about the things, you know about the culture, history, you know about maybe the history of you just know stuff. You accumulate a lot of information about the world and what's gone before you, and we called it general knowledge across various domains.
Right.
That's gone. They don't have it anymore.
Interesting.
They don't know things.
Yeah.
Now that's not an accusation. I don't say that's a moral crime, but I find it a bit concerning, given that so many people in that generation are wedded to their phones all of the time, in a one-to-one relationship with algorithms that really understand them.
Yes.
And know what to feed them.
Yes.
And we know that the current situation is characterized by the presence of a lot of very bad actors.
Yep.
In the direction of technocracy and all of that. Or even what we're seeing in England this week, instilling the right thoughts in people, the right attitudes, the right perspectives, the correct and acceptable perspectives on the world and all of that. I think there's and I think there are two ways of looking at this. I've got no idea. So in a way, I hear what you're saying, right? They're different from us. Something new is going to happen. Let's get out of their way and and let them see what they come up with. The problem I have with that is that a generation of kids that don't really have what we call general knowledge and therefore cannot contextualize new information as it comes in about various things is really a great boon to people who would rewrite history, which we're seeing, or even rewrite reality in real time, subvert and rewrite reality in real time, which I think is happening. It's going to happen more as the censorship increases.
Yep.
I have a feeling that this group of this generation is very vulnerable. And I'm just thinking like an older guy, thinking these may be old categories, but is very vulnerable to being is programmed to manipulated, persuaded into a certain assimilating and internalizing a very particular view of the world and a set of values by design in a kind of cybernetic mode through the phone.
I don't have an issue with that at all.
Right. So that's all I'm saying, really. I don't know really where this is going to go. I would love to think that in time, in ways that we maybe can't understand, which I think is kind of your take, is that they're going to do something and they're different. Something's going to emerge from that.
Right.
And that probably has astrological dimensions that I don't understand. But just looking at it from this more worldly perspective and looking at the whole problem of woke and the indoctrination of young people and the kind of craziness that we're in, I have a feeling that there's never been a moment at which young people have been so manipulated.
Yeah.
And that to me is something that we really need to try and understand better and what the consequences of it might be.
The thing that concerns me is behavior modification through the phone. And it's not even in ways that we fully even understand. Right. But I will give you an example. And the example is that over the past year, right, my son developed a relationship with somebody, which is kind of rare in their world, to be honest with you.
Getting rarer, but apparently,
right. Yeah. So he develops this relationship with this person. I met them, seemed cool enough, right? You know, she came up to me. She said, she asked me, you know, tell me 3 of your craziest conspiracy theories. And she didn't ask me that because she wanted to make fun of me. Right. She asked because she wanted to know. Right. I'm like, okay, we can go here. So she and her friend sat there and they listened to me and we had a nice little chat. So I had no animus towards this. I thought, okay, if it works out, fine. Right. But as the relationship evolved, I could see that the voices in her head coming through social media were starting to affect their relating. Right. And it was things like apps and, you know, Instagram and, you know, in all these, you know, all these, you know, girlfriends, right. Like being, in places with other guys and drinking, right. It began to seep into their relationship. And then there's this, you know, kind of like, you know, primary hypergamy that they're starting to practice. But it's not even like fully fleshed out and real. Right. Yeah. So now, you know, the relationship gets triangulated and there's the group that's getting in her head. Right. And all of a sudden he's not good enough for her. Right. And then there's all this drama that goes along with it. In the aftermath, in the wake, and there's always the social media stuff in the background, right? Always. And he would pay attention to what she was doing on Instagram or one of their apps on campus or whatever, right? And it was driving him mad. And I said, why don't you just block her and shut the relationship down through the app? And I'm not sure. I'm just asking myself this question for the first time. Was it the fact that he didn't want to do it because he was very attached to her, the relationship, first love? Or was it that he was attached to the connection and the intimacy through the app, right? That allowed her to stay in touch with him while they were not together. And it's like, I think it's, you know, partially too, like he cuts off the app, and that he no longer has this connection with this person that he was able to check in on and see her social life and, comment on. And I just thought, and I don't want to, give away too much of my son's life, but as they moved further apart in the aftermath of their relationship, the material he was seeing on the app became more damaging to him.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it just drove me crazy. Like, it was driving me crazy. So to your point, right, this is where this whole technocratic virtual world and behavior modification is very insidious in ways that we don't even understand.
We don't understand it. We don't really have people of our age don't have reference points for it.
That's
right.
Just
can't understand it.
Yeah.
So, I think it all seems very concerning in the kind of cases you're talking about, and
in a weird way too, Gary. In a weird way too, it's not even her fault, right? She gets caught up.
She's living in the reality that's presents itself to her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is what else are you going to do when you're a kid? That's what you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I worry is that there is so much manipulation. The architecture behind this of behavior modification coming from behind the screen is very sophisticated now.
Yep.
Very sophisticated. And you've got to wonder where that leads for how that impacts the development of the person.
Yes.
The maturation process, the stuff we were talking about earlier. Forget about like rites of passage and kind of graduated stages towards adulthood. Forget about that's all gone. This is even the next step, isn't it? It's somebody else is in control of the psychological and social maturation of your child.
That's right.
And what the hell is going on?
And the weird part about it is how the group is used to basically ensure that modification occurs.
Yeah, that's the Machiavellian or devilish brilliance of it.
Yeah,
they know that we're social.
Yes,
it's a whole social brain thing. They know it's known more than ever now on the base of the research that we are intensely social, and what's the guy? Social physics, Alex Pentland. You know this guy at MIT?
No, I've never heard of him.
Social physics. He's saying. So you should look into him. He's a really interesting guy. He's saying now that we have all of this data, we can start to use the system, by which he means, I guess, the phones. We can start to, and since the algorithms are so sophisticated, we can start to move people around in a swarm-like way.
Yeah.
On the basis of what the algorithms know about their emotional responses, their preference, and all the rest of all that. So he calls it social physics. And it's the way that if the technocracy happens, this will be how it gets accomplished. It's about using the devices and the people's they may complete addiction. Addiction is not the word anymore, is it? It's just a necessary thing like breathing.
Yeah.
And the attachment to their devices and their non-stop interaction with devices to kind of start to shape and direct their emotions in particular directions on a swarm-like basis.
Interesting.
And he's really influential. I mean, people flock to him for advice. This is not some kind of crank. He's kind of schooling and giving advice to all kinds of corporations. He's got various acolytes who studied with him at MIT who are out there now all over the place.
Right.
And they're looking at using this system as to moving up from the kind of manipulation and shaping of the behavior modification of the individual to the behavior modification at kind of collective swarm-like emotional levels.
Interesting.
And they talk about and that's got to be watched because that kind of information and know-how is in the back of our kids' phones. We might not see it.
And you know that there's some kind of self-learning going on too with all these interactions.
Yeah.
Right. There, all these psychological dynamics are happening within the app, and then there's texts and keywords. Maybe there's videos where people show their emotions, right? All that stuff is hitting the back end.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Emotional contagion,
and be processed through some form of self-learning.
Yep.
Which is terrifying, actually.
So yeah, that's all. It's a far cry from the Sex Pistols. What my 16-year-old has to contend with.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so here's where I want to end our show on. Well, we were just chatting before we hit play. You talked about the Lion of Millwall, and why don't we end on that story, because it's a really interesting story, and it's really in some ways like one man against the system and one man against the mob.
It's a very inspiring story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall I tell the story? Okay. So 2017 was a bad year as far as the rage and despair of the English at the moment is rooted in a long trajectory of events. 2017 was a big year. We had the area with the explosion, the blowing up of children at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. 52 people killed. Targeting girls again, Ariana. And then in the same, I think a little bit later in the year, a bunch of so-called jihadis jumped out of vans on London Bridge and just ran amok, cutting people to pieces with machetes. I think they killed 8 people and injured I don't even know how many with machetes. I know that a lot of people say, false flag, psyop. I know that's real because I know people who were there. So London Bridge in the centre of London leads you from the financial district into southeast London, which is where I come from, which is Millwall territory. And even though that area south of the river, around a place called the Borough Market, has been very gentrified and it's got restaurants, clubs, nightclubs, it's very nice global space now. It's still very adjacent to the old Millwall area. And a lot of the Millwall fans just go there on a Friday, Saturday night to socialise. So they come, these so-called jihadis, there are 3 of them, all British born. They've got pink, curiously. Pink, these kind of really, it's like that machete, just about a foot long, maybe a bit more than a foot long. 3 of them, and they're just hacking people to pieces, and people run. I get to a pub where there are some more local people drinking with the tourists, and I think 2 of them get into the pub and just start hacking at people.
Wow.
One guy sitting there, his name is Roy Lana. He's now a kind of folk hero for many people in England. He's just a real hardcore Millwall guy. He's just sitting drinking beer with his pals. It's Friday night, so he's probably had a few. And they come in with his machetes and they say, blah, 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 blah. And he stands up and he says, "Fuck you, I'm Millwall." And he begins to contend with them. So they've got machetes and they're hacking at him, and he's using his forearms because there are pictures of him in hospital. His arms are they just hack the shit out of his arms. And he's contending with them and he fights them. He fights them because he's a Millwall guy and they're in his part of the world. They're in his territory. He would have done anyway. So this guy, he's just a very normal guy, and so he fights them, and he fights them. And while he's fighting them, people run out the back door. We don't know how many people got out the back door while he's holding them up. He fights them in the end. I can't remember all the exact details now, but I think he pushes people should check. I think he pushes one of them out into the street and the police shoot him. Anyway, he basically contends with 2 of these guys with machetes who have already killed 7 or 8 people, and he just stands up to them and fights with them unarmed. And he wasn't the only one. What wasn't in the media so much was while they're running around, because there were quite a lot of Millwall guys or Millwall type guys in the area socializing, they're contending with these guys as well, but they can't get close enough. You can't really get close enough to a guy with a machete to contend with him, so they're throwing stuff at them, staying close to them to try and stop them. So that's going on as well outside. So basically, that's what happened. So in the end, there's this terrible bloodshed. It's all on a Friday night in London. And in the aftermath, I mean, they really injured a lot of people. And in the aftermath, that story got into the media, and they called Roy Lana the Lion of London Bridge. Millwall Football Club's symbol is the lion. They're known as the Lions. I should say we are known as the Lions. I still go to football games when I'm there. And so to start with, he became the Lion of London Bridge, the defender and all of that. And then that kind of his celebrity in the media only lasted for a short time. Once the media found out that he was a Millwall guy with criminal offences, had used the wrong word perhaps in the past, vis-a-vis some kind of ethnic minority, I can't remember now, had a bit of a drug problem at one time, substance problem, they kind of memory hold him. That's the story. So that was what, 2017, and in a year or two after that, people like police officers, ambulance, like first responders, and just people to the general public who had shown some kind of bravery, started to get things called George medals, which are given by the state for extreme examples of public spirited
valor.
That's the word I'm looking for, but not Roy Lana. So they memory hold him, and then that went on for years, and then finally people started to build a kind of movement behind him, and they're saying, well, if these people could have the George Cross, why can't this guy? Is it because he's a Millwall fan? So that all went on, and earlier this year he got, from one of the groups, societies that matter, he got a medal, and now things have sort of started. He's been recognised.
Good. But
it tells you something just very interesting if we summarise the story. One is that because he's identified as a Millwall fan, he's a beyond the pale piece of scum. He's an outlier. He's a deplorable exactly. He's a deplorable. He's an absolute deplorable.
Yeah.
And yet, enough people got behind him to support him. And this is telling us something very interesting. These deplorables, and actually there's talk now of the so-called old school hooligan guys who are now my age in their 60s. So it will be a fairly comical sight, all coming out again to try and deal with the situation in England,
right?
In their tens of thousands. I don't know if that will happen. I get maybe you're right about the face-to-face thing, but it's a funny thing that these and I'll say one other thing which I've noticed in America as well, is that now that we are getting closer to what might be a real war, you're starting to see the white working class guys featuring military promotional material again. Are you getting that in America? Now in England, after years of the other stuff, there's an appeal being made to the white working class guys to join the army, which they haven't been doing for some time.
Yeah,
which I suppose we might be in a war soon somewhere. And so these guys are scum when things are good.
Yeah, but they're England's finest when they're not, right?
Absolutely. So Roy Lana, the Lion of London Bridge, look him up and say a prayer for him. He's a great.
That's a really, I think, great story. And I don't know about. I mean, you've probably been there. I've got into a few fights in my life, but and maybe one or two situations where I had to use my wits to get out of something. But I've often asked myself, like, what would I do in a situation like that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how would I respond?
How many of us would approach crazed? I think you were talking recently about that archetype of the crazed swordsman on one of your shows.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
How many of us would stand up and move towards guys like that?
Right.
Unarmed.
Yeah. Yeah. Not many. Not many.
Vanishing few, I suspect.
Yeah.
And so, but that's Millwall. I mean, in essence, that's the Millwall idea, spirit.
Right. Well, I think it's a great story to end on, and I'm glad that he was recognized for his valor, and hopefully he'll inspire more Roy Larners. In the moment when the moment arises.
Maybe he already has. Yeah, I have the feeling that maybe what we saw last week in England was somehow he's in the picture somewhere as an archetype.
Yes,
in working class.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, there would be a time when somebody like that would do something like that, and they would be a legend.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right. He would be legendary. The people would talk about him for generations. Right.
Yeah.
So, Gary, this has been great, and long overdue. And thank you so much for being here and taking time. I know it's kind of late there for you, but this has been awesome. And anytime you want to come back on the show again, you're more than welcome. And thank you.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Wanted to do this for a while, and I'm really glad I did. So thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Okay. For everybody else, we'll be back on Sunday night And that'll be another edition of Sunday Night Astrological Live or Astro Live. And yeah, you're on Twitter. People can follow you on Twitter, right?
Yeah, they can. I don't do much there. I just circulate information. I don't.
Yeah, Gazza Rob. You're Gazza Rob on Twitter.
Right? Gazza Rob. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not very active on social media. I just go on Twitter to kind of keep information circulating.
Right. So people can follow you there. We follow each other, so you can follow
yeah.
Gary through me. Okay, everybody. Take care. We'll see you on Sunday night. Have a great Friday. God bless. Bye for now.